Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry we're a couple of minutes late. I know I said 4 o'clock, but just waiting on some technical issues. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. I am going to wait for people to hop on before we really get started. I see that my good friend Karl Kanthak is here, so I will bring you in, Karl, before we actually get started with the presentation. I just wanted to go live because I do know people are trying to watch, and the way this StreamYard software is set up, if you don't have it actually live streaming, people won't actually be able to see it and think that it's not happening or that they're in the wrong place. So how are you, my friend?
Well, I'm good. I'm just negotiating all of these different online this, online that, of course. How about yourself?
I can hear you. I can hear you. Are you able to hear me loud and clear?
Yes, you have a good audio, good visual.
Okay, excellent. And I want to thank you so much because for those who don't know, Karl, I will just let you know that Karl and I have known each other, I think, since 2019. It was when I first called you and became acquainted with you, and then I met you in person only once down in D.C. at the vaccine injury epidemic event in November of 2019. And we've, kept in touch since, and he's helped us a great deal. Karl testified at the public hearing in February here in Connecticut. Well, not here in Connecticut. It took place here in Connecticut, but it was online. Karl joined by Microsoft Teams, I think it was, and gave his testimony virtually. And now he has agreed very graciously to come back and give a presentation that he has prepared. I am not going to take any credit for it, although he has allowed us to use it here at the Connecticut Freedom Alliance. So I very much appreciate that. But I am not going to take any credit for this because Karl did all the work. I mean, this isn't even his state, and he spent time doing this. And the reason, Karl, I think that you do it is because it's not about the state, it's about the issue, and it's about the children that are going to be affected by this.
Exactly. And, to quickly recap, my involvement is that I don't have an injured child. I'm not I don't address vaccination as a practice. I address vaccination policy as it relates to schools. And and my original entry into this was right around the time I was coming onto a school board. One of our families asked for a private meeting, and one of our really supportive, strong families, and said that there was legislation pending that if it passed, they would be unenrolling their children. And so I started to ask them. I learned a lot about the issue from them because parents, and I said, well, why don't you want to try vaccinating? And the wife goes, try. We did, and then our daughter ended up in the emergency room, and that put them on the path. And they, very well educated and affluent couple, and they went to the finest doctor in the area, and they went to the correct, had a viral panel done, a bacterial panel done, a chemical panel done, and they had a person come out and examine their home that was a residential toxicology specialist and look for black mold and and it was just by a process of elimination. And they finally determined that that series that she had received had pushed her, into a pretty critical health state, and that they were not willing to take that risk again. And so that was sort of a surprise to me. But then I started to research the people or the manner in which the legislation was being promoted, because they were using this statistic that was implying that 65% or so of Washington children had no vaccines. And I knew that was false simply from what I had known. We get briefed on that every year at the school board. And so I did some more research, and it turned out that the proponents were using a statistic for children that aren't in school yet. And it's called the NIS. There's a name for the series, 431 by 314, and it's how many children between the ages of 19 and 35 months have received this entire series by this certain milestone. But then by individual series of it. So that's how many. So 65% of the kids have got all of them, And then by each series, though, the numbers are 80, 90, what we normally see. And then the particular school district that I represent, we're a micro district. We're a K-8 school with 60, anywhere between 45 and 70 students, depending on the year. And I saw my school listed as a unacceptably high kindergarten exemption rate at 12.5%. And that puzzled me because we only had 8 kindergartners that year. And it turned out that one of the children had opted out of the chickenpox vaccine. And that because one of 8 is 12.5%, then that pushed our complete rate down to where we were at 87.5. So that really sparked an interest in me to look at this. I contacted the bill sponsors and various people involved and said, why are you using these incorrect numbers and misrepresenting this situation? And they basically said, well, the numbers don't matter. And I said, well, if the numbers don't matter, use the right ones, because that's how justify this legislation. And I, as an elected official, the only way that we can properly provide governance for the agencies that we oversee is if they are honest with us. So, for example, if the superintendent of the school where I'm on the board was fibbing to me, I would have a difficulty knowing that, but I can't provide proper governance if I'm not getting the actual facts. And that's what drives a lot of this. And and my dad was a big accountability guy too. So that's another strain that puts me in this. And then, I know that there was some question from the potentially the legislative attendees today that I don't have an online footprint, and the reason for that is because, except for you, I don't really. This is abnormal for me to do something that's more or less public. And typically, what happens is I'm contacted by a superintendent or a school board official or an administrator or a state representative who says, I'm being shown this. It just doesn't feel right. Can you take a look at this? And then I end up, I do my analysis, and then I present that analysis to some group of selected people. And so anyway, that's why there's no, and this is not something that, this is something because it's important that, and again, that, that elected officials can only provide proper governance if the agencies they oversee are completely transparent. And
I agree.
You look at this last year that we've been through, and I think that it's, I don't know that anyone would argue with the idea that at this point in time, we know that public health will color the information in order to provoke the desired response, and that they'll perhaps exaggerate or something to if they think that that's going to get a greater compliance for whatever the behavior is they're trying to encourage or discourage, and which is understandable in an emergency situation. But we're talking about the policy that we're addressing here is not whether or not children should have any vaccines. It's whether a child who doesn't have every single one of the 24 or more that are required for school now should be banned from school and forced to forfeit their state and federally constitutionally guaranteed access to a free and appropriate public education that the parents are paying for with their taxes.
Right.
And in that framework, that's a much more significant question.
And Karl, to your point about paying for this with taxes, a lot of parents, here in Connecticut have said, okay, if my child is kicked out, am I going to get that money back? The answer is clearly no. But they should, in my opinion, because you're taking money, ostensibly for a purpose for the education of your child, and then you're not actually allowing. It's one thing if you choose not to send your child to a public school,
right?
But when you're not allowing that child to enter the school, the parents should get a credit back on their taxes, or should be able to get the money back in a check. It's my understanding that you have. I know that you have put together a PowerPoint.
Yes.
Do you know how to share your screen?
Let me see if I can. I think I can figure that out.
If you look down you'll see it says share.
Okay.
And what you want to do is you want to share the window, either the application window or the whole screen, and then click on share audio as well if you have any audio component. I don't think you do. You're not playing
No.
any videos or anything like that.
No. Okay.
But anyway, while you're doing that, I just want to say that is why, again, we are so grateful. Not only that, because you're so good at what you do and you can share your knowledge, but the fact that I know that you don't do this routinely,
Right.
publicly. Have you come to testify for us before? Yes. Have you, given us a lot, presentations and emails and done interviews with me? Yes. As a matter of fact, I enjoyed this time of day a little bit better than the last time I saw you. If you remember, it was during the 24-hour vaccine marathon, and I think I saw you around what was it? It was just before midnight or thereabouts my time, and then or maybe a little bit after.
No, it was 11:30 my time.
No, it was 11. It was just before midnight your time, right?
Oh.
It was almost 3 o'clock in the morning my time. That's right. So this is a little bit of a more reasonable hour, just after 4 Eastern time. So yeah, if you want to go ahead and share that, if you're able to do that.
Yeah, let me.
And then I'll be able to make it full screen. Everybody can see, because this is going to be a very important presentation. We are having this recorded, of course, so that we'll be able to edit it. We'll be able to share this information widely, because I think it's important that we disseminate this information. Knowledge, as we like to say, knowledge is power, and knowledge is also nobody should be making any decisions about the health or safety of our children or the future of our children or of our state without having all of the facts, all of the data. Are you having trouble getting it up there on the screen?
No, I think I can do it here. Yeah, and I would absolutely say I'm not discouraging, anybody. I don't want anyone to interpret that I'm trying to discourage anyone from vaccinating or anything like that. Is that this is simply, as I said before, this is a policy issue, and that there are potentially unintended or unexpected or unintended consequences from these policies, and that's partly what I address through the show today. So, all right, let's see if that.
I see it. I'm going to put it in the screen, and I'm going to make it go full screen.
Very good.
So there we go.
Okay, so this has the pertinent legislation listed, and then all sources or government or agency linked media, and this is the best information to my knowledge, and I will update at all if I'm corrected, and then of course not legal or medical advice. Okay, where is my advance?
Sometimes if you just hit the arrow key too, it'll let you go to the next slide on your keyboard. I don't know if that will work in this case.
There we go. All right, here's our outline, which is what are the Connecticut vaccination and exemption rates? What are less than 95% MMR schools? Legislator specifics, if you were briefed that California SB 277 was a success, you need more information. What will be the real impact of eliminating exemptions? Vaccine failure, can vaccines as a product meet the intended objective? And then immune compromise, should a truly immune compromised student be in a school environment? So this is a capture from the January 22, 2021, so just this year, from the CDC. This is the MMWR, and it is every year the schools, on November 1, they produce a report, and in the case of Connecticut, you actually have a full 100% of the students were reported, and at that you have 96.2% complete for 2 injections as of November 1 of the school year. And then, as you can see, if you look up from that highlighted box, the national estimate, a national average, is 95.2. So you're fully a point above, 1 percentage point above the national average, above the median. And then the religious exemption rate is not an outlier at all. The national average is 2.5% there, and that's what you have. So that doesn't indicate that there's any sort of a problem here. Now, this is from America's Health Rankings, and they compile various sources. This is from the CDC National Immunization Survey that I mentioned earlier, and they rank the states, and Connecticut is always in the top 10 and has been first before. This year, they are the 5th highest coverage for that 19 to 35-month-old survey that I had mentioned previous. So those 2 slides right there should negate any reason for ending the religious exemption. You have above average MMR, and your other vaccination rates are at the kindergarten level exceed the national average. You have the 5th best rate for preschool. So then when you go to the media, though, you see these stories about the number of schools that have less than 95% MMR rate. And there's highlights, and then, of course, there's the link to the story. And then that bottom box is that, 134 schools have reported MMR immunization rates below 95%. The implication here being that that is being caused by religious exemption usage. And the problem is that that statistic was not religious exemption usage. It was how many kids are reported vaccinated. And there are other reasons besides exemption that a student is not vaccinated. And that's one of the confusing parts for someone that's not, if you don't deal with this all the time, someone's either vaccinated or they're exempt, when there are many statuses that will be outside of that. So here's a school, Bryant School, and they have 45 students in their school. And as you can see, they have an 84.7% complete for 2 MMR, 15.3% non-compliant, and 0 religious exemptions. And actually that school at 45 students, it has so each student counts as 2.2%. So even that 15% is 7 children. Now in the right box, you see and I'll just read that, is Connecticut schools with less than 95% is not primarily caused by religious exemptions. Many schools with less than 95% MMR have 0 or less than 5% religious exemptions. In most schools with an actual 5% religious exemption, it is not even 5 students, because the average Connecticut school has only 60 kindergarten students, where each is measured at 1.3% or more. For example, here we have Bryant at 2.2. Noncompliance is caused by missing records of homeless or undocumented students. So the McKinney-Vento Act requires that homeless students be enrolled regardless of records. And I'm not entirely certain what the rules are for undocumented students. The other confounder is that the second MMR injection is CDC scheduled between the 4th and 7th birthday, and Connecticut enrolls kindergarten students who are age 5 by December 31, but then you said possibly just for the whole year. These students are not exempting, but simply in the process of aging into the second injection. Prior to the late 90s, a single MMR was considered complete for life. I believe that you added a second MMR, which must be received by 7th grade in the early.
That is correct.
Yeah. And then the report closes on November 1, only 60 days after school starts. So this is really a data collection issue. If the concern is what are our vaccination rates, and I have petitions in with our State Board of Health, because the measurement system is designed back when the bulk of the shots were given before the age of 3 or 4. It was much fewer shots, but you had one MMR at that time. And then there are now these 4. There's the second MMR, the second chickenpox, the 5th DTaP, and a 4th injected polio are CDC scheduled between the 4th and 7th birthday. And so you have children, if you have a kid that just turned 4 or 5 at the beginning of the school year. And then some of the schools, if they're mixing in their preschool or their 4-year-olds into the 5-year-olds, all of these things are confounders, and it makes this much more nuanced, again, than someone is being just simply vaccinated or unvaccinated. Now, this next slide is, I can be excruciatingly thorough, so I'm not going to go deep into this, other than the fact, and I'll tell you what, Brian, it's very important to me that I am as accurate as possible, because I don't want to be guilty of what I'm trying to, the problem I'm trying to solve, which is correct data. So,
exactly.
But here is an Excel printout, and I just picked one where there was a lot of schools with less than 95% MMR, And so on this page, there was 14 schools, and you can see the school name on the left, and then the town, the county, the type of school, public or private. Then you have the various vaccine series. And remember that there are no single vaccine injections anymore. They're all series. And if we look at, and then this is color coded. So the 8 blue boxes are schools with less than 95%, and yet they have 0 religious exemptions. And then here's the top, if you look on the left side, Halland School, that is a school that legitimately has a 5.3% religious exemption rate, but it's only got 39 students, so that's 5.3% is 2 students measuring at 2.65%. And then there are other schools with the green boxes they do have some religious exemptions, but not over 5%. And when you drill down into this is a terrible statistic. Is if you're going to sort for religious exemption, then sort for religious exemption use. If that's what your claim is that overuse of religious exemptions is causing unsafe conditions in the schools, then that's what the statistic should be. Now, shifting into here, so that's theoretically the basis then for why the exemption need to be ended. And something that I've run into in assisting various states is that both direct testimony to me from legislators, and then also you can understand what someone has been briefed by the nature of their questions or the statements that they make. And what I discovered is that various proponents of ending non-medical exemptions are using California, so misrepresentations of California SB 277 legislation by proponents for ending non-medical vaccine exemptions. So various proponents of ending non-medical exemptions are misinforming state legislators about the structure and impact of California SB 277. The pitch is along these lines: your state's vaccination rates are dangerously low, caused by non-medical exemptions. California eliminated their 2.5% exemption and gained over 5% vaccination rates immediately. Remember all the drama when the bill was in play? Then when SB 277 passed, only crickets? That is because the parents are just pretending to be committed. If you pass the law, they will all resume or start vaccinating to stay in school. Ignore the citizens and power through. It is worth it. This is what state legislators are being briefed. And I was accompanying a woman, single mom that had an appointment with a legislator here in my state, and was meeting with the assistant, and they were discussing the issue, and she, very distraught and heartfelt, and said, look, if you pass this law, I can't quit my job and homeschool my daughter. And the guy kind of had this reaction. He said, well, you'll just get her vaccinated. And the woman just, she said, don't you think I wish I could do that? She goes, do you have any idea how much easier my life would be if I could just vaccinate? She goes, I did vaccinate, had a similar story to that family that I met a long time ago, and she says, I simply cannot take that risk. Do you have any idea how I would feel if we tried again? And she was injured. And I could tell by the legislative assistant's, I could tell by his reaction that he was completely unprepared for that response. So then I did some digging around and found some documentation of what I'm going to show next. Well, here's what happened. So if you think about now, New York, I believe they ended their exemption in a single day. And, you have to think about it. And then the question here is what happened when New York legislators believed this pitch and ended exemptions like that? Lawsuits and protests. So here are all of these theoretically uncommitted people who are just, that are going to give up if the bill passes. And this is outside of a courthouse with a temporary restraining order under consideration. And then another a school district, because they didn't consult any of the education community. And so you have a board of directors saying that they oppose this requirement. Educators are pushing back against excluding exempt students. I have a private confidential group I testified publicly here in Washington State, and then various school board people, administrators, and such contacted me. And this is such a polarizing issue that they want to be they want to be confidential, but they want to actually know what they can do to help maintain the exemption and keep their kids in the schools. What happened also in New York is that there was overzealous implementation of vaccine exclusions quickly morphed into the denial of critical services for students, and this became quite popular. Was the story of this young boy who, I believe he was missing only his final maybe 11-year-old DTaP, and yet was kept out of school and requires a great deal of services to be able to function properly. And then New Jersey was attempting to copy New York and discovered that New Jersey legislators started the process and learned that exempting families are very committed. There are no casual exempters who would resume or begin vaccinating. Casual exempters do not exert the effort to directly engage the legislature. And then there's a picture there. And then for yourselves in Connecticut, I know that in 2020 you had a marathon 24-hour hearing and then cut off the online hearing recently at 24 hours. And do casual uncommitted citizens attend marathon legislative sessions? So I think it's important for the legislators to understand that if they're being told that they're going to get a high rate of compliance, or that people are going to resume or start vaccinating, that's simply not the case. The pressure to vaccinate is so crushing that nobody is just casually or nonchalantly exempting. And when you look at the stats here, okay, you've got a 2.5% exemption rate. So in an ideal world, if you got all of those people to start, it's only a 2.5% increase. Those few locations that appear like they have a low rate, as I explained previously, that's because you're using the wrong search. They're using the wrong criteria to make the report. So the question is then, where were the protest after California SB 277? This picture here, I think New York passed a law in July, and then in September, immediate implementation of everyone, if I understand that one correctly. And so the answer that there was no protest after SB 277 is because they didn't kick everybody out right away. In fact, SB 277 didn't kick anybody out right away. So this calendar chart is explaining the implementation and timeframes. So SB 277 requirements, implementation, and timeline. Top left box, SB 277 passed on June 15th, 2015, but did not enact till July 1, 2016. So you have a full 1-year grace period. So that immediate following year, there was zero impact. Now, not only that, but families were given 6 months after SB 277 passage to obtain new personal belief exemptions that can be grandfathered for up to 6 years. Then when SB 277 did enact on 7/1/16, that year, all grades 8 to 12, they were still exempt and permitted to attend through graduation. Grades 1 to 6 were still exempt until they reached 7th grade. Independent educational plan, individual education plan and 504 students, independent learning. There are several categories of education that are still exempt and outside of SB 277, so that each year you've seen only the students entering 7th grade, and then students coming in new either at kindergarten or at any other grade from out of the area are impacted. So that's, if you take a K-13 system, that's 8% per year. So what that has done is this is what California Department of Public Health really means when they claim that they ended all non-medical exemptions. There will be exempt students in California public schools for several more years. This is clear proof that the California Department of Public Health knew that very few exemption-using families would resume or begin vaccinating. And that was apparent when the several thousand parents showed up in Sacramento, and California Capital is, 7 or 8 hours away from Los Angeles, the main population center. It's 3 or 4 hours away from San Francisco, 2 to 4 hours. I don't recall exactly. But anyway, it's not an easy place to get to. And people went through the effort and to make their feelings known at that time. California Department of Public Health knew that passing SB 277 was not going to increase vaccination rates, but was instead simply forcing exemption using families out of the public schools. That's why it has so many carve-outs. They knew what the optics would be, that had they just said, that's it, no one can attend anymore, you would have had, California as one of the most populous states, you would have had almost 200,000 kids. The phased implementation of SB 277 is facilitating the under-the-radar exodus of these families into alternative education or even moving out of state. Why are anti-exemption proponents misrepresenting that families will resume or start vaccinating? Because they know that very few responsible legislators will support a bill that denies citizens of their state and federally constitutional guaranteed free and appropriate public education. They will vaccinate provides cover for a vote that is clearly against constitutional protections in the citizen's interest. Ending non-medical vaccine exemptions does not change the behavior of exempting families. California K-12 enrollments have decreased every year since SB 277 passed, while alternative education environments, many outside of SB 277, are increasing. Enough families are moving to other states to avoid SB 277 that is being described in news articles. So after SB 277 passed, a citizen was concerned that exempting students will no longer be attending school or receiving school lunches. SB 277 sponsor, Senator Dr. Richard Pan, replied, most families of students with PBE exemptions will eventually get their children vaccinated when they wake up to the truth, thanks to SB 277. So an assurance here that they're going to. And then here's another story, which has quite a bit of detail into this assertion, is that Dr. Pan is quoted in this article as saying, most parents are on the fence. Pan said, it's not because they don't believe in vaccines, they're nervous about them. And so what happened is the law pushed them off the fence and they got their kids immunized. Now, I don't know, those pictures of all of those people outside of the capitals and protesting don't look like they were simply nervous about them.
Nope, they sure don't.
They don't look like they're on the fence to me. All right. So also from that same article, opponents of California's bill also predicted that if it became law, vaccination rates would remain the same while school enrollment would drop. And then the opponents were correct. K-12 enrollment has dropped every year since SB 277 has passed. And this is EdSource is a California-centric online education information website, and you can see the title there, California's K-12 enrollment drops again, charter schools see an increase. And this is in 2019, a total of 34,135 fewer students were enrolled this year compared to last, more than 4 times the drop experienced the prior year. So they've been losing 6,000 to 8,000 a year, have been shifting out of the K-12 system. Until this year, the biggest single year decline in the past 5 years has been 8,783 from the 2014-15 to 15-16 school year. So that was some families immediately reacted to the bill passing to just, okay, that's it. We have the ability to let's leave right now. Now here's a story from a San Francisco newspaper that's relating self-styled California refugees moving to Idaho to avoid vaccinating their kids. Some California parents who moved to Idaho to avoid vaccinating their children are calling themselves refugees, according to an Idaho Statesman investigation. Here in Washington State, I've met several families that did exactly the same thing. So legislators must understand that ending exemptions results in kicking students out of school, not increasing vaccination rates. What about the vaccination rates? Is that being misrepresented too? Yes, there are several factors in vaccine data collection can be misunderstood to mislead or exaggerate the impact of exemption on vaccination rates. So I've gone through some of those, and I'm going to get a little wonky, but here is a chart that was in that previously linked article. Measles vaccination rates rebound in California. This is to provide the evidence that SB 277 worked. And so the chart there on the left-hand side with the vertical axis is percent vaccinated, and then across the bottom is the academic year. And then the horizontal red line just below the 98. Okay, that's indication of the above that is exempt students, 2.54%. That's what the exemption rate was. And then below that line is that the 97.46% of the students were not exempt. So if they were not listed as vaccinated, it didn't have anything to do with exemption. And then the call out box on the bottom where it says low complete rate due to conditional enrollments, not exemptions. So conditional is what California calls their non-compliant, what Connecticut designates as non-compliant. And then I'll read the box. SB 277 did not implement until the start of the 2016-17 school year. So you can see the rectangle red box down near 16-17 and then the segmented line going up. So you see that high increase on the traveling line, and so all claimed increase in reported complete vaccination rates was shifting not exempt conditional, who are students that are vaccinated but missing documentation or second MMR dose, into the complete category. This was accomplished by threatening to withhold money from schools with high conditional rates and delaying the port and close until the end of the school year. All of this reporting improvement could have been achieved without SB 277. There are few or no new vaccinators. Behavior was not changed. So, theoretically then, and there's a small disclaimer in the article where they concede that, the bill didn't actually, potentially the SB 277 is not responsible for the rise. And then if you go deeper into the California Department of Public Health documentation, they describe this policy of really cranking down on the schools. So as we saw previously with the Bryant School example, where you have a 15.3% non-conforming, cleaning that up is how you can get your rates up. The case for eliminating the religious exemption in Connecticut is very weak. Vaccination rates are excellent. The exemption rate is average, not excessive. The less than 95% MMR schools concerned, it collapses under scrutiny, and ending exemptions would not address non-compliant students anyway. So we have, again, looking at Bryant with 15.3%, getting rid of exemptions doesn't change the vaccination rate in the school without any exemptions. Vaccines as a product cannot provide 100% coverage, so the test for school attendance is not immunity, but vaccine receipt. I agree and understand the intention of eliminating exemptions, which is that the idea is that everybody going to school, nobody could catch whatever the targeted infection is, but the vaccines are not 100%, therefore that cannot be achieved. There are vaccinated yet susceptible people of all ages in the schools. It is debatable whether an immune-compromised child should be in school. The question of why an immune-compromised student should have a greater claim to school attendance over an exempt student has not been debated. And then I'm going to take some supplemental slides and address vaccine failure rates, vaccination rates failure in IC students. So the key point to remember when trying to understand the impact of the exemption on any vaccination rate is that it can only reduce the rate by its nominal value. So the national exemption rate and Connecticut's is 2.5. 100 minus 2.5 is 97.5. Any rates below 97.5 are unrelated to exemption use. We saw that on the chart from California. And then with this small overall exemption usage, any low vaccination rate claims are measuring artifacts. There are many reasons besides exemption that can make a student not measure as vaccinated. Tracking systems use various names for not exempt, but not recorded as vaccinated students. These names include conditional, non-compliant, out of compliance, provisional, and others. Proponents of ending exemptions often cite statistics that ignore these other categories. For example, in California, the 2.5% exemption rate was blamed for an only 92% complete rate, a mathematical impossibility. The real cause was their 6.9% conditional rate. And then the 100 plus schools in Connecticut have less than 95%, which we have seen is not normally caused by the religious exemption. Then this is details about you have a disharmony between the medical schedule that the doctors have in their office, which says these 4 injections need to be administered between the 4th and 7th birthday, this 3-year administration window, but children are starting school at age 4 or 5. The report close date, 60 days after the school starts, and then the tracking systems have not been updated to track students who are in process. They could add a properly vaccinated for age, would be one. They could list by the number of injections and show how many 1 injection MMR, 2 injection MMR. And then since I believe it's 2015, the McKinney-Vento homeless are diluting the statistics. And then, to get these, what are alarmingly high exemption rates are the situations where you're measuring these small populations where a student measures as more than 1%. Now, here is a story from this is a medical online website, STAT, and this story was about a huge national mumps outbreak that occurred in 2019. And what it discloses in this article is, if we take the top box, large and lengthy mumps outbreaks have been reported in multiple places across the U.S. over the past couple of years, often among people who've been vaccinated. So this is, a concession here that fully vaccinated people can and do become infected. Then you have on the left-hand side, the antigen escape box. Vaccine strain contains A mumps collected in the 1960s. Strain G is the current circulating. So just like antibiotics can selectively, breed superbugs, well, what happens is when you suppress a certain genetic strain of these conditions, then the other ones will adapt to that. We're hearing this already with the COVID vaccines. And then the box there where it shows that, primary vaccine failure, 3% of measles vaccine recipients are never protected, 12% of 2-dose mump vaccine recipients. So 88% of mumps recipients are never protected. So if the objective is to have 100% immunity, if you will, in a school, that's simply the product is not capable of achieving that. And then here are citations from the Connecticut Department of Public Health, and they call it exclusionary diagnostic criteria. So sometimes pertussis outbreaks will be disguised because the treating clinician will use their vaccination status as a exclusionary diagnostic criteria. Well, this can't be pertussis, must be some other kind of generic respiratory infection, and then not log it or treat that. So you have in that left one that a history of 2 MMR doses does not exclude a measles diagnosis, and on both sides. So this is clearly, again, if a fully vaccinated person is capable of becoming infected, then that it means that the objective of 100% immunity is simply not possible with the products as they are available today. And then those same statistics are cited in the news article. Both sides are ready for battle over repeal of religious exemption. That's from a recent story there. Now, next has to do with the immune compromised being in school. So the left panel here, these are the Connecticut reportable diseases. You can see there's several dozen of those, and of those, there's only a handful that are vaccine targeted. And then the right panel shows, again in the yellow, are those that are targeted by, that have a vaccine that is targeted at them. But then the other infections in red are, infections of note. And so the question would be, is if you have an immune compromised person, do you really want them in uncontrolled spaces where there are 223 and 497 cases of strep? You've got other conditions of which there are staph infections, et cetera, that are quite dangerous, that are out in the community. I know that when my mom was under chemo for breast cancer, we were very careful about where we went. Here's a care guide. Immune-compromised patient treatment guides consistently advise against exposure to the recently vaccinated. Our schools warning immune-compromised students. Connecticut law provides home instruction when vulnerable, should immune-compromised students even be in schools. Washington also provides this same service to families that, of course, if your child shouldn't be in school, then the state has a responsibility to educate that child. So there are provisions for home instruction for kids for whom being at school would be a risk to them or to others. And then the box on the left is care. This was from Johns Hopkins. Now, it's interesting that after vaccine exemption legislation was circulating through the country, they went back and edited and took out some of these, which was quite interesting to me because it had a 13-year history prior with multiple reviews and no changes. And then suddenly when it becomes an issue for vaccine exemption legislation, that's changed. But here on the right, this is the current Stelara drug. This is a patient prescribing information for the immune suppression drug Stelara. It's used to treat plaque psoriasis, psoriatic arthritis, and Crohn's disease. And it says caution is advised when administering live vaccines to household contacts of patients receiving Stelara because of the potential risk of shedding from the household contact and transmission to the patient. And, typically when someone is going to undergo some type of therapy like this, the standard of care is that the recipient is fully vaccinated and then they, prior to receiving that treatment. So again, is that if your child is truly at risk from a vaccine-targeted infection, they are also at risk for a number of infections that are not vaccine-targeted and much less controlled and much more prevalent. So summary is then that the Connecticut vaccination rates are some of the highest in the nation. Less than 95% MMR schools is a measuring artifact caused by the issues previously discussed. Vaccines as a product are not 100% and cannot provide the objective of universal immunity. It is a debatable decision to place a truly immune-compromised student in the uncontrolled school environment. Connecticut law recognizes this and provides for at-home instruction. Legislators should understand what the real results of ending non-medical exemptions will be. There will be few new vaccinators. There will be movement to educational environments outside of vaccination requirements. Families will move to states with superior respect to religious expression. And a vote for ending exemptions is a vote against these Connecticut families. So that wraps up what I had for you there, Brian.
Well, thank you so much. That was really, really excellent information, Karl. We do have, I'm sorry, I lost you there for a minute. We do have a question coming in, just a moment.
Yes.
So this is a question actually from one of our state representatives, actually one of our greatest allies. I dare I say our greatest ally. She is State Representative Ann Dauphiné, and she's asking, the California law did not include private and/or charter schools?
They have a category that they call independent study, and that is it's a little bit fluid, but yes, so that there is a window through which children are able to go to school, and that can fit within the charter. I believe it's the charter summary. So yeah, the law does provide that, and in fact, what I'll do is I'll send a copy of their legislation to you, Brian, or I believe I might have the email. So I'll send the actual.
Well, yeah, you can send it. You're actually on an email chain now with the whole public health committee, so you can send that to all of them.
Yeah, and then, but the other part is the independent, the IEP and 504 students, because they're federally, they have there's a federal mandate that those students have to receive their services. So students with that designation are allowed to attend school regardless of vaccination status.
Well, I mean, technically, what they'll say under the law is as long as they provide them with their programming and services at somewhere, whether it's in the school
Okay.
building
Yep.
or remotely, that they fulfilled their requirement, providing a free and appropriate public education. But I'm going to push back on that a little bit from a legal standpoint, and for a couple of reasons, if I may.
Sure.
Number one is, well, the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, specifically says that these children are supposed to be placed in the least restrictive environment. So how in the world is making them get speech and language therapy or occupational therapy or physical therapy in some other location outside of the school, some community center or some library or something? How is that the least restrictive environment when you're not only, I mean, they, schools can get in trouble for just removing a child from a classroom if that's not the most appropriate setting for them, and just putting them in a separate classroom within the school building. Because years ago, I don't know if it was the same way when you were in school. We're not too far apart in age, but they used to have just separate areas of
Yeah.
the school, a separate room for special ed kids. They used different names that weren't as kind back then, and just put them all in a room together, and that was their separate education. That's not allowed under the IDEA to even do that. So how is putting them in some completely different building somewhere else in town going to be acceptable? That's number one. Number two, the issue of separate but equal comes up. Brown versus Board of Education very clearly stated. Now, granted, this was with regard to race. That case did not have to do with disabilities or disabilities in education. The IDEA did not exist at that time.
Right.
But regardless, the principle still applies. The court never said separate but equal is never acceptable, except when it comes to disabilities, or except when it comes to age, or except when it comes to sex. Or no. They said it's never acceptable. It can never be acceptable. Separate is not equal. Okay, in an educational setting. So if it applies to race, it applies in this context as well, in my opinion. That's just my personal legal opinion. I'm not offering, as you say, legal advice either. I'm not doing that either, just because I'm an attorney. But that is my professional opinion, that it violates several things. In Connecticut, we have Article 8 of the Connecticut Constitution, which is an express right. The Connecticut Supreme Court in Sheff v. O'Neill in 1996 said that there is an express fundamental right to an education, to a public education, in Article 8 of the Connecticut Constitution. Article 1st of the Connecticut Constitution contains both the right to free exercise of religion, of course, just like the First Amendment, as well as equal protection under the laws, which is also in the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So what they are clearly doing, how are you giving equal protection to laws if you're saying this fundamental right to education is only afforded to this segment of the population and not the other segment, not the non-vaccinated? Our governor, believe it or not, you may or may not be shocked by this, but I don't know why I was shocked, but I was a little shocked that he would say this in public. It sounds more like something I would have expected him to be thinking or to be saying in private to his other, buddies in the governor's office or in the legislature. But he came out and, you know, in an interview with NPR earlier this week, they were actually talking about this idea of vaccine passports, right? To get into businesses, to get into restaurants, whatever. And he said, well, maybe there's a white male conservative, that doesn't a little bit grumpy about getting vaccinated. Maybe he'll have to do it if he wants to go to the NASCAR race.
Wow.
Uh, Actually said that stereotyping, white male conservatives, NASCAR fans as well, insulting to them as well. But, we issued a press release strongly denouncing that. I'm actually going to be going on the radio at 5:40 p.m. my time, so just under an hour, on the Todd Feinberg show, and I'm going to discuss that, among other things, on WTIC 1080 AM. You can listen live online if you're not in the area, which I know you're not. But here's the thing. He also said in that same interview that there had been discussions with business owners, with restaurateurs, about the possibility of keeping a vaccinated versus non-vaccinated section of the restaurant. Now, what does that sound like?
Mm-hmm.
I thought we were done with that. I thought segregation was over with. But people don't get indignant about this the way they do about race. Like, it's okay to separate, based on vaccinated versus unvaccinated, based on your medical status. That's okay. Okay. But it's not okay for anything else. It shouldn't be okay for race. It shouldn't be okay for age or disability or anything. But it certainly shouldn't be based on your medical information either, and your religious beliefs, because many people who are not having their children vaccinated, it's because of their sincerely held religious beliefs. So you are not essentially, what you are doing is you are separating people, segregating people based on their religion. Why is that acceptable? Why don't I hear outcries about this from the left, from the Democrats? Why don't I hear them saying this is horrible that he would even suggest this? It's horrible, the comment he made about the white male conservatives. I mean, why am I not hearing any of this?
There's it's the cognitive dissonance between the and the vaccine mythology is that vaccines are 100% safe and 100% effective. And if that was true, this would be I don't know that this would be an issue. Part of this, I mean, there are reasons other than, the safety and efficacy to not have one. But clearly the intent, when it comes to the police powers of the state, we've been under that for a year now. We've experienced directly what those powers are, and there is a legitimate interest by the public in protecting the safety. And the issue I have with for example, the school rules is that they're tying this back to the case in 1905. But if you take a look at the conditions of 1905, what did a hospital look like in 1905? That viruses had not been isolated yet. And you had a condition that, reputedly, smallpox had a 30% mortality rate. It's airborne, casually contractable, and there was no treatment for it at that time. We have no antibiotics. They weren't wearing rubber gloves yet. Just the basic sanitary procedures that we take for granted now. 1905, most of the transportation of items in and out of the city was done by horse, and you had manure all over the streets. The conditions of the country were dramatically different 115 years ago than they are today. And what we're doing is we're exerting a police power for an infection that, again, was airborne, transmissible, untreatable, and had a potentially 30% mortality rate. And
one vaccine.
And a single. And the other part is that in Jacobson, it had nothing to do with attending school. It had to do with could a municipality make a requirement, and if that requirement was not met, could you fine the person? And his objection was, I don't want to pay the fine. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we're really all about that. What's interesting is Washington State actually has a law that prohibits the forced smallpox vaccination, which came in sometime in the 40s, I believe, 30s or 40s, because that was a very reactive vaccination at that time. But again, I concede that there are times when the state it's appropriate for the state to take certain actions, but the school requirements as we see now, I just don't see that as meeting the level. We were working with one legislator on what would be considered the smallpox standard, which is that if an infection doesn't have a 30% mortality rate and another, doesn't meet those criteria, you simply can't take this kind of action. And again,
right, even though the court in Jacobson never actually used such a standard, so I could argue that it's even lower than that. There's no bright line test, but the bottom line is that when you are taking away a fundamental right, such as the free exercise of religion, such as in Connecticut and some other states, the right to a public education, you need to show, and the Supreme Court has said this many, many times, you need to show that there is first a compelling government interest, meaning like, for instance, a public health, a real emergency, like people, dropping dead in the streets everywhere, what you described, the conditions in 1905, there's no alternative. And that it's the least restrictive means of achieving that interest, of that goal, that compelling interest. And they can't meet either part of the test. But the point is, if you can't even get past the first part, which is that there's a compelling interest, you don't even get onto the second part of the test. So it's really erroneous, this idea that, well, because in the future that Representative Matt Ritter, who's now the Speaker of the House in Connecticut, has said in the past, well, there's a possibility. We want to be proactive. They want to be proactive here. It's the first time in my life I've ever heard a Democrat being proactive. They want to be proactive, in this case, because they're afraid that there could be an emergency. Well, that's not the standard articulated in Jacobson. It didn't say if the government's afraid that there might possibly at some indeterminate point in the future be an emergency, then you can take away fundamental rights. That's never was said. And as a matter of fact, what's very often ignored about the Jacobson decision, and I mentioned this almost every single time I discuss this decision, and I'm glad you brought it up, because I don't think enough people realize that what the decision actually says, because there's a lot of rumor about what is in the Jacobson decision. But I want to just read something to you, which is actually from the conclusion of the decision. It says, here it is. So this isn't the exact quote. I try to do this fly because I think that I'm slick, and I'm not as slick as I think I am. Although there's actually a great article that I want to share that just came up in my search that is called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. It's not your great grandfather's public health law. And that is an article that was you can find it on the NCBI, National Institute of Health, NIH.gov site. But if you search for Jacobson v. Massachusetts, it's not your great-great-grandfather's public health law. It talks about how the law has evolved. The Supreme Court law has evolved since Jacobson, and how it's so much different, than it was. The landscape, the legal landscape, everything from bodily autonomy, Roe v. Wade, all those decisions, everything's so much different than it was back in 1905. But
absolutely. Well, and the real stain on Jacobson is that it was used as the justification for the forced sterilization laws.
Absolutely, and nobody wants to talk about that either.
It says in there that the ability to, and of course it didn't actually force it. It said we can fine you if you don't do it. But that the smallpox vaccination is more dangerous than cutting the fallopian tubes or the other structure on a male, and so that this certainly must cover that, since it's a less risky procedure. I was kind of shocked when I was studying that.
Yeah, well, you know what? It is shocking, the history of eugenics in this country. A lot of people don't know about that either. Yeah. All right, I found what I was looking for.
Okay.
The concluding paragraph of Jacobson, or towards the conclusion, I should say. Before closing this opinion, we deem it appropriate, in order to prevent misapprehension as to our views. So what are they saying?
Right.
We don't want people to be misinterpreting this, which of course they did for the ensuing 115 years or so. Before closing this opinion, we deem it appropriate, in order to prevent misapprehension as to our views, to observe, perhaps to repeat, a thought already sufficiently expressed, namely, that the police power of a state, whether exercised by the legislature or by a local body acting under its authority, may be exerted in such circumstances or by regulations so arbitrary and oppressive in particular cases as to justify the interference of the courts to prevent wrong and oppression. Extreme cases can be readily suggested. Take that to heart. That is the paragraph.
That's pretty clear.
Very clear. Everybody should be cutting and pasting that, should be shouting that from the rooftops. I put it in blogs. I put it in my interviews. somehow it hasn't caught on, probably because the powers that be, such as the media, wouldn't want that to catch on. That is actually what Jacobson says. It does not say the state can do whatever it wants with no evidence of a compelling interest, with no science to back it up, can just declare it from talking heads like Anthony Fauci and just say it, and therefore it is. I speak, therefore it's true. That is not what Jacobson said. There still is accountability. There still has to be restraint. But see, here's the problem.
Well,
you give them an inch and they take a mile. This is the problem with even giving the government that option, even opening the door a crack. Look what it did. Look what's happened in the last 115 years.
The proportionality. I agree. Well, I'll tell you what. I also found the section then for the representative is that so the exact language in the SB 277 for the IEP, this section does not prohibit a pupil who qualifies for an individualized education program pursuant to federal law and section 56026 of the Education Code from accessing any special education and related services required by his or her individualized education program. And then the part about then the other was this section does not apply to a pupil in a home-based private school or a pupil who is enrolled in an independent study program pursuant to Article 5.5, commencing the very citation of the Education Code and does not receive classroom-based instruction. So that's, that's my understanding of it. I think the big shock for me when I actually looked at that was the fact that was the slow implementation. Because as of course the popular national, the nationally recognized popular opposition to that bill, and it became apparent that no, these people probably aren't going to resume or start vaccinating. What are we going to do now? And then various news organizations were doing some pretty deep research and interviewing parents and interviewing schools. In my case, and again, is that the funding follows the student. You have a FTE, full-time enrollment, and Washington has, I think we have 90 districts with less than 300 students and 40 districts with less than 100. And there's a handful with less than that are single room, schoolhouses, one-room schoolhouses on the prairies in the eastern Washington. And then we have a couple of single 8-10 person schools in the Puget Sound on islands. There's a school at the tip of a long lake where the only way you can get there is by a boat, and they have it's a 4-person district, and which is basically a guy who lets the neighbor's kids come join his kid. But in those cases, and if you've got 13 students and you're in the middle of nowhere, and consolidation of districts doesn't work out here because you can't put a kid on a bus for an hour and a half each way. Put a 5-year-old on a bus an hour and a half each way to go.
Well, you know what? Nothing would surprise me after what they've done to these kids this last year with the masks and everything else. Nothing would surprise me. We have a few more questions coming in and comments. And again, the current proposal in Connecticut does not exempt the following children. That was right around the time we were discussing the IDEA kids, special needs kids. So I think she's saying it just doesn't exempt them, which is hard. But that's going to run afoul of federal law, and there'll be lawsuits for that if that passes. Oh, you got a fan there. Karl. What about students? Oh, Joseph was asking around the same time who also qualify for IDEA and have religious exemption. Do they really think they can kick kids out? Well, it's exactly what we've been talking about. No, I don't think, and I don't think you do either, that they can kick these kids out and not violate it, even if they do separate them to some separate building somewhere, some community center. It's still not the least restrictive environment.
Well, I can tell you this, is that shortly after, before when SB 277 was starting to implement, one school had put a tent in the parking lot, and they got in a lot of trouble. They were putting some of the kids out in the, exactly as you say, separate is not equal. And I'm not an attorney. I can, I read, I have decent comprehension, but had there been and you see the results again. So I think the surprise was, okay, that everyone thinks SB 277 just went, cleaned it out, boom, it's done. And that's what's being represented to the legislators in other states, is they've got, I don't know who it is that's briefing them, that's coming in and saying, hey, look, here's all you got to do. These people are going to really, they're going to object. Actually, that article that I have a couple of sections from, they use the ban on indoor smoking and try to draw an analogy there that, okay, people complained and everything, but once the law passed, nobody tries to smoke indoors anymore. And they're trying to say that that's an accurate parallel, which of course it absolutely is not. And so again, what they're doing is they're saying, okay, as the California playbook, if you will, is you find some statistic, whether it's relevant or not, and claim that it's too low and blame it on exemptions, and then say, hey, look what we did, it worked great, everybody's happy. And that's simply not the case. I mean, when you see people leaving the state, that's how much more committed can you get? And there are other people that would leave the state if they could. How'd you like to be upside down in a house in California that you owe more than it's worth?
Well, and that's the case for not a few people in California, more than a few, I should say. Joseph's asking, we were told in our district that if this passes, they will not hold expulsion hearings. They will instead be issuing disenrollment letters. How can they disenroll a student when we have the Eighth Amendment? He's referring to Article 8 of the Connecticut Constitution, which says you have a right, fundamental right, to a free public education. Good question, Joseph. Good question. How can they do it? And not only Article 8, I didn't mention some other anti-discrimination laws. There's 46A-64, which is a public accommodation law, and schools are, especially public schools, are a place of public accommodation that says you can't discriminate on the basis of religion, or a basis of creed is the word that's actually used in that statute. It's even broader than religion. And then there's a specific anti-discrimination statute that's specific to schools, which is Connecticut General Statutes 10-15C, which says that you cannot discriminate in a public school on the basis of religion, of religious belief. So you're running afoul of those laws. You're running afoul of the Constitution. You're running the federal Constitution, the state Constitution, the IDEA. There's so many laws that will be violated if this passes, even in a form that, they're saying they're going to grandfather in possibly. Well, the proposed bill said it would grandfather, the first proposal, they're changing it now. The first proposal said it would grandfather in kids in seventh grade and up. From 7 through 12, you'd be grandfathered in. If you had an exemption on file at the moment that it becomes effective, the law becomes effective. The problem with that, as you know, Karl, is that's still, here we go, that's segregation again. So you're saying you're now discriminating on the basis of age as well. So, because, not that everybody's the same age in these grades, but by and large, the older students will get more privileges than the younger students. And within families, you'll be discriminating. So we'll say, okay, well, you have 4 children in a family and 2 of them are in grades 7 and 9, and the other 2 are in grades 5 and 3. Those students have their religious, the older kids in the same family have their religious beliefs protected, but the younger kids don't. It's just so ludicrous and so discriminatory.
Well, and the issue is so much more nuanced, because it's not like, there's so many vaccines now, and I was speaking with one representative, and I told him, look, if you want to lower your exemption rate, take chickenpox back off the schedule. When we look at the individual school districts in Washington, many school districts, 25 to 40% of the exemption is only for the chickenpox vaccine. I had the most at our school when we only added it in Washington, I think was 2006, and I overheard an exchange between a parent and the person working the counter, and he says, well, since when? It's not like this is something that anybody knew. Oh, he's supposed to have a chickenpox shot. And he says, well, he already had chickenpox. And he goes, I know, but I can't. You have to have a note from your doctor. And he says, I didn't take him to the doctor. It was chickenpox.
Right. Why would you?
She goes, well, I'm sorry, but you have to have a note from the doctor. And he goes, well, if it's in his record of the doctors, it's only because I told the doctor. So, and if it's not, it was only be because I'm going to go tell the doctor, and he's going to write me a note, and I'm going to bring that note back. So, since both of these are based on me, why don't we cut out the middleman? And I'm just telling you, he already had chicken pox. And then she said, okay. And then at that point, she said, look, I need something. Just sign the exemption, right? So there's, I mean, that is the true convenience use of exemption, is as a paperwork go around, not as somebody who's trying to avoid, or get tricky with their medical choices. But yeah, again, it's, in these, trying to figure out, it's just so problematical to implement something like this when, as you say, I mean, and again, look at this, the rolling implementation of SB 277 is proof they knew that it would be a disaster if they just said no one with an exemption can go to school.
Which they did in New York, though.
But that, well, they were tricked, and they do have a disaster, and it's been somewhat mitigated by Corona in a way, because it hasn't been front burner because nobody's in school. Had we
right, and it's almost like they knew that was coming.
Well,
I'm not going to go there, but it almost, because that provided a perfect cover for them. It really did, because once that hit, well, let's see, that was June 13th of 2019. So that went into effect in the 2019-2020 school year. But halfway, well, a little more than halfway through the school year, 2/3 of the way through the school year, everything shut down.
Exactly.
I mean, so it was a rough fall, and there were protests in the fall and things like that. But again, since then, there's been very little coverage, to my knowledge, in the mainstream media in New York or in this area about the religious exemption issue. It's mostly been about COVID.
Sure.
It died down pretty quickly. And then in Connecticut, it gave us it worked to our advantage in Connecticut, because we actually got, we actually had a free pass basically on the 2020 legislative session, because they were about to pass this bill. This was about to go to the House floor to be debated and voted on, and everything was shut down, and the legislative session ended, and it never got passed. This year, interestingly enough, Karl, and I know we're going to wrap up, because it's getting kind of long here, and I have to go on for an interview. I don't want to waste your time either, but I do just want to say, interestingly, is last year in 2020, in February of 2020. We had a 21.5-hour public hearing, and within 5 days, it went to the committee. All day they debated it, and they voted it out of committee in that meeting. So within 5 days from the public hearing, it was voted out of committee. It has now been a month. It has now been 1 month since, actually, exactly, was it February 26th? I think that was the day of the public hearing. 1 month since the public hearing, and still it has not been put on the agenda. These bills have not put on the agenda for a vote. And there's talk, and you alluded to it in your communications with me earlier, that you've heard too, that there's been some pushback, some disagreement, some infighting about this. That's good. That shows that our efforts are working. But
well, obviously, I can say this, is that when I've been tapped and done analysis for other states that were considering this legislation, when a straight up legislator looks and finds out that the issue's been misrepresented to them, they'll turn into a hard, and again, as I said, they turn into a hard no. As I said before, an elected official, our responsibility is to oversee, provide governance for these agencies. And when these agencies are not being transparent and honest with us and providing us with the best information, we can't do our job. So when you have someone coming in saying, hey, this is what the rates are, we need this bill, and then suddenly they learn those aren't the rates, it's so interesting when I've had a couple of legislators. So why am I learning this from you and not one of my people?
Good question. Good question.
Yeah,
It's because they're playing hide the ball. It's because they're being underhanded. They're not being forthright. And no, I mean, I would not want to vote yes for any bill on any subject if I found out that I'd been lied to,
yeah,
essentially. So I don't blame them for having that
yeah.
opinion. All
And
right.
that might be what's happening, is that they might be, because again, and it's a simple sort. You just take that hundred and you take that data set with the schools where on whatever it was, 134 have less than 95% MMR. Well, then you switch the parameters to, okay, how many how many of those schools have 5% or more MMR? Excuse me, religious exemption. This is not. It's just, and I'm not at all. I'm no mathematician. This is all basic arithmetic done with a simple calculator on my phone. This is
As
not.
I was telling you
Yeah,
earlier, though, as you saw in an earlier email and text, we were having a discussion earlier. You know, I made the statement that it doesn't really matter whether you have credentials in math or statistics,
sure.
because, like you said, it's simple math and numbers don't lie. Facts are facts, regardless of who is presenting them. Okay, so if you have a question, about the data, fine. That's a fair question. If you think that the numbers don't add up and you want to dig into that and you want to question the numbers don't add up, but I the legislators in the public health committee have a habit of doing this, and it's not just with you, so don't take it personally, Karl.
Oh no.
Every public hearing, whenever we have provided in one of our experts, whether it was you or Dr. Chris Shaw, who came on that same day, actually it may have been February 16th, not the 26th, but whatever. It's been over a month. Um, they try to find any way to discredit the person, because why? Because they can't discredit the facts. They can't discredit the information. If they could discredit the information, then that would be a much better argument for them. But they can't, so they try to distract from that by trying to discredit the person, saying, "Well, you can't believe anything he's saying because he doesn't have the right credentials. He doesn't have the right letters after his name." We have people, yet we have people on the committee who are saying that they have absolutely no public health credentials themselves. We have two physicians who, in my opinion, are the only ones who could possibly even begin to opine on public health matters. One person who fancies herself a public health expert, but who is essentially a nutritionist, a dietitian, who has a PhD in nutrition. That is not public health. That is not a scientist with research expertise. Yet she proceeded to tear into Chris Shaw, who's a well-credentialed scientist who has published many papers. You know Chris, of course. He's not too far from you. Well-credentialed research scientist, extremely brilliant, and tried to act like she knew more than him about immunology, vaccines, or public health, which was a joke. Okay, so show me where you can dispute any of what we're saying, dispute the facts. I challenge any legislator who may be watching, and I doubt many of them are, other than our good friend Ann. I don't think really any of them are. But if they are, I challenge them to dispute any of the facts you presented, or Chris, or anyone else that we presented. Show us that the facts we're presenting aren't true. Forget about who's presenting them. Prove to us that the facts. They won't do it. You won't hear anything from them. Why? Because they can't do it.
Well, I again, I just simply go to the CDC. Everything that I showed, it was the CDC, the Connecticut Department of Public Health, the California legislature for the information about SB 277, and so I mean that's what I'm going to do, is make sure that all of those sources are as pristine as possible.
Yep, and I've never found. And I've been watching your work for a long time, and I've never found. I've never taken issue. I've never found anything that was erroneous. And if you do, if there is, if there ever is something in the wrong place, whether a decimal point or something, you'll immediately point it out, and you usually catch it. And I don't really remember that happening much at all, if at all. But if it did happen, I know you're the type that you would correct it yourself before I would even notice it, because you are very meticulous about having the correct numbers.
And I have no great investment. I mean, I'm not, I mean, my purpose here again is if a legislator is going to make this decision, they need to have the most accurate information as possible, and they need to have the correct understanding of, if they vote for this, what's going to happen next. And that in an ideal world, that information would be provided to them from the people that are advising them, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't.
Well,
anyway,
if it is, they're ignoring it because none of them who are proponents of the bill have admitted that they were wrong about anything or admitted that we were right about anything that we're saying. So if they are, they're either willfully ignoring it or they're I don't know. I don't know what to speculate. But anyway, at this point, I'm going to wrap up. I want to thank you so much, Karl Kanthak, once again for doing this of your own volition, investing your time. Karl is not being paid to be here today, just so everybody knows. Okay, he does this because he believes in this, because he knows it's the right thing to do, and that's called being a good human being in my book. So I really appreciate your time today, and I think we got to pretty much all the questions. I'll stay in touch with you as this progresses. I know you're keeping an eye on it anyway, but thank you very much for your time, and you have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.
Well, thank you. And I hope to be of some help.
All right, great. Okay. Take care, Karl.